This video is all about the box squat, why I use it in my training with my athletes and why it can be a successful accessory for your athletes or yourself if you're looking at building strength in your squat. Hi, my name's Tyler. Welcome back to the channel. Let's jump into it. The box squat, popularized by Louie Simmons and the Westside Barbell Method. Louie Simmons used the box squat as a cornerstone of Westside's training because it teaches proper mechanics, builds explosive power, and reduces risk of injury. By sitting back onto a box, not down, the lifter learns to load the hips, hamstrings, and glutes, developing a faster, more strong posterior chain and speed out of the hole. The brief pause removes stretch reflex from the hips, forcing pure concentric power on every rep. The benefits of the box squat that Louie Simmons found is it builds hip and posterior drive, it improves squat depth consistency, and it reduces knee stress. This is where I gained the inspiration for this variation for what I like to call the low box squat. The low box squat takes most of the principles that Louie applied to the Westside Barbell Method. However, it forces the athlete to squat below parallel, somewhere about 2 to 3 centimeters deeper than what they're comfortable with. This can be performed as both a dynamic effort piece where speed and concentric power can be the focus, but it also can be used as a general strength component for athletes who struggle to hit depth or who lack the understanding or the awareness around the hips. This also allows for a lower skill variation of a pause back squat, teaching athletes to maintain lower body tension when they come to that dead stop in the squat without the stretch reflex of the hip flexors, of course. This is how I like to teach the low box squat. I'm gonna set up a stool or a stack of plates that forces you to have your hip crease below your knees about 2 to 3 centimeters below parallel. Brace hard using our Valsalva maneuver. Initiate by breaking at the hips and knees simultaneously and focus on a tempo descent as we don't want to impact the box or rush the lift. We need to be able to maintain leg tension, and if we drop too quick, we're going to end up hitting the box too hard. Relax only the hip flexors by sitting back slightly, but avoid a full rock back. This is a different movement entirely. With maintained leg tension, mainly through the quads, sit back forward slightly to line up your bar with the midfoot, and then leg press the ground away by thinking about driving all your tension through your midfoot. This is a pretty simple movement. Rinse and repeat depending on rep and set ranges. Here are the benefits. It builds posterior and hip drive. It also improves the squat depth consistency like Louie Simmons' method. It also reduces knee stress. I find it also teaches our ability to maintain tension in the bottom, being a great carryover to eventuating to the pause back squat. And the brief pause removes the stretch reflex, forcing pure concentric power on every rep. A couple of variations to this movement, stuff that I don't normally add in, but they can be added on. There's the rolling box squat where we sit all the way back and almost take the feet off the box before driving forward and standing. And we also have the bouncing box squat. Now, I'm not too experienced when it comes to the rolling box squat, but the bouncing box squat I've used quite heavily with a lot of my athletes. The same kind of technique applies with this particular variation of the movement. The main thing being is we don't sit back or rock back on the box. We allow the stretch reflex to be used from our glutes, our hamstrings, and our quads to fire out of that bottom position by lightly tapping the box with our bum. This can be a good follow-on step for someone who's using the low box squat to gain squat depth consistency, and then it allows them to utilize the stretch reflex to continue progressively overloading. This is almost basically just like a back squat where you touch your bum on a box to give you a guide or a tactile cue to say, hey, you're squatting deep enough. Let's talk about suggested rep ranges and set sizes. This can be very flexible, just like a back squat. 5x5 will work on a low box squat. You can do anywhere from 3x3, a heavy single, or more dynamic speed work, 12x2, 10x2, 8x2, etc. Anything kind of works really well with this, but what I found with my athletes that work well with the low box squat is a sequence such as this. Normally we start with 8 sets of 3 week 1, 8 sets of 2 week 2, and 8 sets of 1 week 3. We reset that cycle in a wave loading format, and we go back to 8 sets of 3, but we remove accommodating load. So the first phase of the program, I like the use of chains to help really maximize that concentric force and to force lifters to break through that sticking point, generally we find at the 90-degree angle of the hips. We can obviously addition this to adding 5% each week, increasing the load, but reducing the overall intensity by reducing a rep. So you end up going from 24 reps with chains at 50% to 8 reps with chains at 60%, which a 10% increase doesn't seem like much. It does get pretty hard towards the end. When we reset into the next set of the wave, we remove the chains and we start much higher on the percentages where it comes to the low box squat. 8 by 3 at 70%, 75% for 2, and then 80% for 1. This is obviously super challenging towards the back half of the program, but it's definitely very achievable, and I'll tell you why. We actually tested the ability to perform a max rep with chains on a low box squat to find what would be an average percentage for the majority of lifters, and we found with chains, 80% was pretty accurate as far as what most lifters got. They varied from about 70 to 90%, the majority of them getting around that 80 to 82.5% range with the addition of about 80 kilos worth of chains. As far as a max out without the chains, I'm not sure. I've never actually decided to do it with my athletes. Will I ever? Potentially, maybe in the future as a little bit of a bonus component or something a bit fun, but it's not something I've planned at this stage. Cons. There's always cons to any good movement, and these are things that you should be mindful of if you decide to use the low box squat in your training protocol. Number 1 being the setup. If you're lifting with multiple lifters, of course, heights, lever lengths are all going to be different, which means that the height of the box is going to be different from athlete to athlete. Using a set stool may not be the best idea for the majority of athletes, as we don't all have the same limb lengths. That being said, you can obviously have a standard stool of what you would consider as a low box point, just as a standardization for all athletes if we're trying to be fair in a one-on-one competition where we're looking at maxing out this particular movement. However, obviously if you have really tall athletes and really short athletes, squatting to the same height might not be ideal. This way you can utilize plates as a bit of an alternative where you would stack plates up similar to the height of that low box or stool, and this way you can adjust it depending on the lifter. I normally use 4 25 kilo bumper plates or Olympic lifting plates plus a 10 kilo ollie plate as well, and that makes up the low stool. It might seem like a lot, but it is still very low as the scheme of things go. Equipment use would also be a con as well. If you don't have access to that type of plates or you don't have that many plates to be able to allocate to a low box squat, this can be a challenge in itself. Obviously, having access to chains is always a limitation for most people, but you can always utilize bands as an alternative if needed, or you can get a kettlebell and make it more like an earthquake lift where you attach a kettlebell and a band together around your barbell. The second con is spinal compression. That's probably the most scary thing when it comes to a low box squat, is the increase of compression that it places on your spine. The reason being is when the bar is obviously situated on your back, it creates some form of spinal compression as we squat. Not too much though, because there's nothing in between you and the ground normally. In this case with the box, when you sit on the box, your spine is compressed between the bar and the box, and these compressive forces can obviously create some stress on the back. It's not going to be so much stress that it's something that you need to be worried about unless we're not bracing correctly. Be sure to brace correctly to make sure we're protecting the spine at all times. I always recommend all athletes to use a belt on this particular movement, not to protect the back, but to make sure that the midline is doing its job and we're actually bracing correctly by using the belt as a bit of a tactile cue. I also recommend a lot of lower back accessories for my lifters, as well as some spinal decompression work post-session. Normally what this looks like is either reverse hypers or back extensions from anywhere from 2 to 4 sets of 8 to 25, ranging from heavyweights to lightweights. You can use the reverse hyper or the back extension machine as a bit of a deep spinal decompression in itself, with light rep ranges, light weights with high rep ranges if needed, if you don't have access to a rig. But I'd much rather use the reverse hyper or back extension as a heavier lift to strengthen the spine and strengthen the spinal erectors, and then use the rig hang as a decompressor post-session with 3 sets of 30 seconds at body weight. The last thoughts about this, overall, the low box squat is the cornerstone of Team Tyler's training right now, as it allows all lifters to consistently hit depth and lift at relatively high intensities. When it comes to competition, if we don't hit depth, we don't get reps. So it's pretty straightforward. Building that consistency to the squat depth is ideal. Reducing your ability to use your stretch reflex can obviously create an advantageous or disadvantaged lift, which will be advantageous if we are someone who tends to get stuck in the bottom of the lift. With the addition of the accommodating load in the early weeks, this has obviously helped break through some sticking points, which can be an invaluable addition to your training as an accessory squat method. Hopefully that will allow you to progress further and further into the future. Let me know your thoughts about the low box squat. If you're interested in it or you're not too sure and you've got any questions, please ask down below. Otherwise, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Team Tyler out.